Okay, so we have our gems that we want to use, and now we need to actually make the board bring them into our world. So let's go back into our board script, and then in here we need a reference to those gems. So at the top here, I'm going to create a public gem array, I'll talk about array in a second, that we're going to call gems. Okay, so what's an array? An array is, if you put these open and close square brackets here, an array is basically like a collection of objects. If I just save this here and go back into Unity, it's a good way to demonstrate it. If we let it compile. So we've got our array of objects here of gems. Now we know we have 5 gems. So I'm going to make my array have space for 5 gems. So now if I drop this down, you can see it's looking for references to 5 objects. So that's basically what an array is, a group of however many objects that we want to use. So if I go into my prefabs, into my gems, I can put each one of those into these slots here, like so. And now I have a way to be able to access them. And much like we saw with the tile blocks before, you should remember that in an array, although it has an array length of 5, so there's 5 objects in it, the individual elements are referred to by their numbers, and it starts at 0. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, to get the first object, that's 0, and to get the 5th object, so of our 5 objects, it's number 4. And that's really important to be aware of. So let's go back into our script here, and what we're going to do is, when we want to spawn a gem in, we're basically going to make it randomly choose a number between 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and say, hey, I want to get gem number 3, and spawn that in at this point when I'm setting my tile. So right here, after we place the tile in our scene view, we're going to go down here and we're going to say our int, oops, it auto-completed something completely different. Our int value for, we're going to create a value called gem to use, and that's going to be equal to random.range. So random.range is how we can get a random number. And we tell it the numbers that we want it to be between. So we want it to be between 0 and whatever the gems array dot length is. So we know that our gems here is 5. It has 5 places in it. So gems.length will be 5. And one really important thing to note is that when you're using int values, which if you don't know, generally you'll use an int or a float most of the time in Unity. An int value is always a whole number, and a float value can be any number with a decimal place. So ints will always be like 1 to 100, 1,000, 1,000,000, whatever. Whereas floats could be 3.7, 5.26, whatever, you know. But what's really important is when you're using int values in the randomizer, it'll never actually pick the top value that you set. So it'll only actually give, if we tell it to pick a number between 0 and 5, it'll always only give us 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. It'll never actually pick the top number. So if I hover over range here, so you can see with the int information in it, it's saying return a random int within min inclusive and max exclusive. So it's basically saying the min will be included, the max will be excluded. So with that done now, we're basically selected for each of these slots. We're saying, okay, pick a random number for us to use, and then we want to spawn a gem into our world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another little function down here, a little private void spawn gem. And the reason I'm doing this here is because we're going to want to spawn our gems in here at this point, but a little bit later down the line, we're also going to want to refill our board. Whenever we destroy some gems, we want to bring in new gems along the way. So we're going to want to have spawning happen in multiple places. So we'll create a function then to handle that. So in our spawn gem here, we need to tell it the gem we actually want it to spawn. So we want to have here, we're going to have a gem object called gem to spawn. So we need to tell it which gem we want it to spawn. And we don't want to just use the number value we're determining here, but we are going to use this number value. But before that, I also want to tell this where we want this gem to go. So where we want it to go is going to be an x and a y value. So that's going to be a vector2. And what I'm actually going to use is a vector2 int value, because we know we're using the x and a y values here, which are both ints. So we're going to use vector2 int, which will always be whole numbers. And I'm going to call this one POS, so position. Okay, so now we know what values we want to send in. So then we can go back up here and say, for our right after we decide which gem we're picking, we can say now spawn a gem at new vector2 int x, which we have up here, and y, which we have up here. So that'll be somewhere between 0 and 7 for each of those. Then a comma, and then we need to tell it, okay, which gem do we want to spawn? Well, look at our gems array, and then inside of these square brackets we tell it the number that we wanted to go to, so 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we know we're picking that and storing that here in the gem to use int. So here we're saying gems at position gem to use that and go into our spawn gem function. And then in our spawn gem function, we're going to say, we're going to create a new gem that we're just going to call gem, nice and simple. And we're going to instantiate that in. And what we're going to instantiate is whatever gem we want to spawn. So gem to spawn, which we know we're sending in, hey, that's just this particular one from the gems array. So the gem to spawn, and where we want it to go is the position that we're sending in here. So POS. And the rotation, again, we don't want it to have any rotation, so just quaternion.identity. Okay, so then much like we did with the tiles, we don't want this to clog up our hierarchy, so we're just going to say gem.transform.parent equals this.transform. And we're also just going to say, although this is something that will change as our game goes on, just for us to be able to see what's going on a little bit better, we're going to say the name will be gem, and then dash, and I'm just going to copy this same rest of this stuff, save us typing it out, just pop the same stuff in there like so. Although we can't use just x and y, but we can use position.x and position.y. So pos.x and pos.y. Here, oh, we're getting a bit of an issue here. I just realized it's looking to create it wants a vector 3 in here, but this is giving us a vector2 int. But what we can actually do is, because we know we're just using 2D, we're only concerned with the x and y values. So we can say here, we're going to create a new vector 3 that is position.x, position.y, and 0 on the z-axis, because it'll always be 0, because we're not making any changes on the z-axis, because we're only working in 2D. Okay, so for the moment, let's just test this out and see this in action. Let this compile. And now, when I press play, you should see, there we go, we get all our gems appearing in our scene. So if I press play again, you'll see every time we get a new random assortment of gems for us to use.